fantasy is, like most fiction, it's going to be concerned with good and evil, and a struggle, and a conflict, and a journey. The question is, is there real virtue in this story, and is virtue rewarded?
Hello, and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
And I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
Cameron, we received a really good question from a family who, I think seriously, but some people may have asked this tongue-in-cheek, have wondered about the proper role of fantasy. And I think we can broaden it out to say maybe not just in like parenting and raising children, but also in Christian growth and formation. Specifically, if we wanted to put a name on it, like why would some people be okay with the Chronicles of Narnia, but not Harry Potter, for example? So if we're going to trend in that direction, but specifically using the word fantasy, can you first of all define fantasy for us? Then let us know if you think Narnia and Harry Potter are that, and then what you think some of the background issues or thoughts are, or like what are some helpful ways to frame how we think about fantasy from a Christian perspective. And if you could do that in 2 minutes, that'd be great. That's a big question.
I'll do my best. Well, fantasy is something that whole books are written about, as defining the genre. So obviously, I won't be able to attack that definition with the kind of subtlety and precision that some might want. But I think broadly speaking, most of us can recognize fantasy involving the creation or the building of fantastic worlds where you have magic and characters like sorcerers and wizards and fairies and some of these. I mean, the word fantastic comes, of course, from fantasy. So most of us would recognize fantasy as being a genre that involves these kinds of worlds. You could do a little comparing and contrasting to get more precision here if you want to get nerdy. Science fiction, for instance, sometimes has interesting overlaps with fantasy, depending on the type of science fiction. But science fiction usually is more speculative. So in that sense, a novel, I don't know if that makes sense. We can talk about, but so something like Animal Farm by George Orwell is generally classified as science fiction, even though it's fantastic in a sense. Or think about Star Wars. Star Wars is really kind of walking the line between science fiction and fantasy. It basically is science fiction fantasy. Whereas something like Blade Runner, which is based on the Philip K. Dick story To Android's Dream of Electric Sheep, Blade Runner is much more straightforwardly science fiction. It doesn't have any kind of, there aren't lightsabers or, the Force or anything like that. There are no magical elements in that. You're dealing with different technologies. So a lot of so I don't know if that there's some boundaries there that might help us make sense there a little bit.
Yeah, and most of life doesn't neatly fit into categories, so I think we can be comfortable saying that there's a blurring of the lines. Let me actually zoom. Let's zoom out on this question first, and then come back to fantasy, and let's talk about the value of fiction in general. Because I have heard people say like, oh, like what's the point of reading fiction? Yeah, I'm a Christian. I deal, or I'm a business person. I deal in the world of real things. What's the value of fiction? I'm wondering if that might be easier. Let's zoom out and say, what do we see as the value of fiction, and can it be spiritually useful? And then push back into fantasy as a subset of fiction to get back to answering this question. Does that seem like a viable move?
Sure. Yeah. So a book I'd recommend here is C.S. Lewis's An Experiment in Criticism, which is not as read. His literary stuff tends to not be as widely read. But basically, one of the arguments he makes there is that fiction helps us see through other people's eyes, or eyes not our own. And so if you want to have the world opened up to you in terms of different perspectives, fiction can do that. Very skillful fiction can do that in ways that few other forms of reading can. So I'll give you a specific example here. You can study nihilism from a philosophical standpoint, or you can study political radicalism from a philosophical standpoint. And there are a lot of really, obviously very long and elaborate books filled with footnotes that are very abstract and, dare I say it, a little bit boring. Or you can read a book like Dostoevsky's The Possessed, or it's variously translated as The Possessed or The Devils.
Yeah, and I thought
And
you might
that
even go throw
puts
Crime and Punishment in there.
Crime and Punishment too. I mean, so Dostoevsky is a great example to give of an author who puts flesh and blood on radical ideas and
Mhm,
shows you through very complex characters with very complex psychology how these ideas play out in real life, and often with very chilling results, sometimes with very comical results. But what you get is a way more holistic vision of how these ideas work. So literature helps us to see the world through different perspectives. It gives us new eyes. It enhances our vision of reality in the sense that it makes the world more rich. It makes the world more strange for us. This is sometimes what I'm, mixing categories a little bit here, but that's what poetry does as well. So it can open our eyes to see the world through different perspectives. It can make ideas, it can show us how ideas actually play out in the field of reality. So all of this
mhm.
these are good reasons to read fiction.
Let me jump in here and interrupt you a second because I think humans think in terms of fiction on a daily basis. Or see if this works out. So let's say you wake up in the morning, you're having breakfast, and you think through. Here are three things that I could do today. If I do this, this will probably happen. If I go to the grocery store at this time, then that means I can drop this. Like we we visualize and think very
Mhm,
concretely in terms of things that haven't happened yet and probably won't materialize
mhm,
in the way that we think they will, but we live them out as thought experiments in our heads in order to make decisions. So you're thinking through, if I do this, then this will probably happen. And whether or not I want that to happen then changes whether or not I decide to do that activity. So there's a sense in which
mhm.
we're building, we work in the realm of fiction in order to help us make decisions in reality as a natural way of thinking. Is that a fair parallel to make here?
Well, yes. I mean, another way of saying that
A
is that
good fiction novel helps us think from another perspective about a possibility?
absolutely, yeah, a good fiction novel helps us think from another perspective on reality. But you're right. We all do this on a daily basis. That's part of our imagination. And I think we hear a word like imagination, and we are liable to think of it as something that just is only basically the territory of art.
Mhm.
And it's obviously operative in art, but that's not the sole function of imagination. In fact, imagination is just a basic way we understand reality. So Malcolm Geit defines imagination as an active perception of reality. And it's really our faculty. Now, this is a controversial claim, and I won't get into the weeds with this and all that, but he claims that imagination is a faculty like reason. There are plenty of people who
Mm.
disagree. Some people say that notion is an invention of romantic poets and whatever. It doesn't really matter. You can go down that rabbit trail if you want. But what his point is that imagination is part of how we put together a picture of our world. It's part of how we synthesize. So the C.S. Lewis quote here that's really helpful is that he says, "For me, reason is the natural organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning." And that's a very helpful way to look at it. So you can have ideas on a page, abstract and maybe highly detailed. But then when you see meaning in those ideas and make sense of them, we do that by fleshing them out in
Is
scenarios, imagined. How does
yeah,
Jesus communicate often and illustrate? He uses parables.
mhm. Is so maybe here's a hang up for us then, Cameron, is that I think I'm
Hmm.
putting words in your mouth here, but I would say that you would critically distinguish between good and bad fiction. Um, in the sense that
Of
if
course,
you
yep.
think of something like Marilyn Robinson's Gilead, if you read
Hmm.
through that, totally everything is fiction about it, but does help you think through robust ideas about the meaning and work of your life. Um, and a whole nother list. I mean, a massive list of really helpful books like that could be put out there. maybe let's just take like an extra crude example in the other direction where Amish romance is fiction as well, but probably
Right.
doesn't
Sure.
have the
Sure.
the deep life transformative spiritual um prodding and convicting.
Right.
So how do we how do you draw the line? Like how do you what's so there's fiction that is probing and convicting, and then there's fiction that's just
Mhm.
entertaining. Some are both. But
Correct. Mhm. Yep.
do you think that the people who are opposed
It's a
to
good
the
question.
spiritual use of fiction are thinking of fiction even in a category that you personally would say like, yeah, that's probably not worth your time?
Well, it depends on how
I
the
mean,
fiction
you're thinking
is
about a subset of
marketed
fiction
in
here.
some.
Yeah.
Yes. So there are different, so some fiction is written just to make money, and really just to entertain. I mean, and so you have everything from James Patterson to Danielle Steele in this category, and I mean varying levels of quality to it. So you have writers, Michael Crichton, I think, is in
I was
this
going to
category
say,
too. Now, Michael Crichton is a skillful. You and I both like Michael
well,
Crichton.
so he's a bit of a crossover though. So you read Jurassic Park as the novel, and it's
Hmm.
a page turner, but also it is a philosophy of science. So it's doing double duty there.
It is,
And
but
Dostoevsky is the same way. I mean,
so.
fascinating stories there. All the Russian novelists were like that.
Hmm. So we need some categories here to help us navigate this territory, because it actually is way more complex. See, you bring up what seem to be simple questions, but they're deceptively simple because they actually bring up a lot of complexities here. So Michael Crichton and James Patterson and Danielle Steele, these are examples of what we can call commercial fiction. So
Okay.
they're
Mhm.
written to entertain and they make a ton of money. That's not necessarily a mark against their artistic merits. Now, it can be. It depends on who's doing the writing. So it's also important to now. I want to couch this carefully because I am a believer in distinctions, in serious distinctions between what I'm going to call high art and
Oh
pop and
no.
commercial art.
Oh no.
And
Here we
some people
go.
some people balk at that notion now, especially today. They'll say how that's very old fashioned, it's very elitist, very hierarchical. So that's extremely unpopular in postmodern kind of thinking. By the way, those divisions have been broken down, and Shakespeare has the same value as an episode of Dawson's Creek potentially. Who knows? So I completely reject that. I don't think that's true at all. And so I mean the division between high art and commercial art or pop art, you know, people have loved breaking down that boundary, but the boundary is still there. But you can also, I mean, you can point out that somebody like Shakespeare in his day was making very popular art on the one hand, but it's also of such esteemed quality that we cherish it to this day. So, granted, sometimes there is a crossover, but usually not.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Well,
And so,
yeah.
so in other words, Nathan, there's a world of difference between Danielle Steele and Marilyn Robinson. There, I said it.
There
Now
you said
we can press more into why that's the case if you want, but yes, there is a world of difference between those two. Yes.
all right, while we're just splitting hairs here, let's split them again one more time and talk about the category of Christian fiction, because I can think
Hmm.
when I think of Christian fiction, I think Veggie Tales. Um,
Sure.
but
Yep.
also the Brothers Karamazov is a much
Hmm.
more
Yep.
robust and spiritually
Hmm.
forming read, but I don't think it was written to
Yes.
entertain a Christian audience. Am I getting this
Correct.
right? So
You're getting
say
this
something
right.
about what
Yep.
Christian fiction.
So I will.
Yeah. Tell us your real
Christian
thoughts.
fiction is a marketing category. Yeah, Christian fiction is a marketing category. A helpful book on this in recent years was Daniel Silliman's Reading Evangelicals, where he looks at, and by reading
Oh, right. Yeah,
evangelicals,
yeah,
he
yeah.
means reading evangelical fiction. Yeah, and he takes a look at Amish romance in one chapter. He looks at Frank Peretti in another. But one of the key distinctions here is that these are marketed exclusively to a Christian audience. Somebody like
Mhm.
Dostoevsky is not. So here's the big difference, Nathan. Dostoevsky is writing assuming that Christianity is true from the top down, that it's a comprehensive vision of reality. And therefore, he's at liberty to portray any subject he wishes, whatever he wants. He doesn't have to try to impose some slant on it. I'm not sure whether this is making sense. He doesn't have to try to skew it Christian because he sees through the eyes of faith. If he's writing about nihilism, he doesn't have to be afraid of that subject because the truth will out, so to speak. If he's faithful to human nature as it really is, as he believes it to be, then you're going to see that, then you can portray reality as it really is. For somebody who's writing Christian fiction that's being marketed as Christian fiction, there's certain words that aren't allowed to be, that won't be included in there. There are certain subjects that will likely be off the table, or if they are, they're only going to be given very glancing kind of expression. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm not arguing that, true art always needs to have lots of really graphic content or, obscenity or anything like that. I'm not saying that. But I am saying that Christian fiction, as it's marketed, is a sanitized vision of reality that
Hmm.
excludes some of the harsher aspects to cater to that audience. I'm not making a comment on whether that's good or bad, but you are getting, that's one of the reasons why you have people claim that Christian fiction as as that marketing category is sentimental, or that it's not first rate, it's not great.
Because people
And it's
feel that
also
it
one of the
doesn't
reasons why,
mirror the reality
incidentally,
that they live in. Yeah.
correct. Yeah, no, it's not a full vision of reality. It's kind of, it's like Little House on the Prairie or something like that. I'm talking about the television series now.
Okay.
And or I don't know, or Leave It to Beaver a little bit. It's not going to give you a full vision of reality. And so a lot of people don't take it seriously. And also non-Christians generally don't read it. It's not marketed at them, then they won't. But now Marilyn Robinson's Gilead is read. I mean, I know so many people who are not Christian who love that book. That book is loved across the board. It has that
Mhm.
kind of, that very broad reach. It is a deeply Christian book, but I think we would say here, the adage would be Marilyn Robinson is an author who happens to be Christian. She's not a Christian author.
Gotcha.
Does that distinction make sense?
Okay, well, let's use that as a springboard to head back in a different direction, to get back to where we started this
Yep.
conversation. So we can
Fantasy.
we
Yeah.
yeah we well, right. So we've kind of looked at, okay, here's fiction, here's the value of it. There's good fiction and there's bad fiction. By saying, there's good fiction, we're not saying that there's not bad
hmm
fiction. So I think everybody hears us on that caveat. Then you use the interesting phrase. Here you have Marilyn Robinson, who's an author who happens to be Christian. All right, let's go back now
hmm
to fantasy and say, is there good fantasy and bad
Right.
fantasy in the same categories? And then here's a distinction. If I'm using the organ of meaning here, using my imagination, and I'm 37 years old and I'm eating my breakfast, and I think, when I go down to the mailbox today, I wonder if a goblin will pop out.
Sure. Sure.
That's
Sure.
that's not imagination in the sense of I'm thinking about a counterfactual of reality that helps me make a decision. But then there is some, like, I would put George MacDonald, um, The Princess and the
hmm
Goblin,
Yep.
as a very, if you want to slow down and read that, I mean, you could read it as a kid's story, but if you want to slow down and think about it, there's some pretty fascinating things being taught there as well. So, all right, give us some pointers
hmm
on good, bad fantasy and the value of it for Christian consumption.
So I think a superficial read on fantasy would be, well, it's bad and it's dangerous because it has magic in it. So I understand that people have reservations about magic and sorcery and spell casting, and of course that's present in Chronicles of Narnia, and that's present in Lord of the Rings as well. And by the way, Nathan, I do know some Christians who won't read either the Chronicles of Narnia or the Lord of the Rings
Yeah, so
for
we
that
shouldn't
very
make it sound
reason.
like a slam dunk. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. So there are people who for whom this is a legitimate matter of that, their conscience is troubled. So okay. I think that's misguided, but I think we can make some allowances for that. But the question is not, is there, good and bad magic in fantasy? Well, usually fantasy is like most fiction, it's going to be concerned with good and evil and a struggle and a conflict and a journey. The question is, is there real virtue in this story, and is virtue rewarded?
Hmm.
Or is it
Interesting.
presenting a vision of selfishness? Yes, where selfishness is rewarded. So as an experiment, and I know that I'm not as widely read in the fantasy genre, but I mean, I do like horror, and horror straddles, and again, is also in the realm of fantasy often. But as I was thinking through this at one point, I made the suggestion you would have a destructive fantasy if it presented a scenario in which selfishness was rewarded. If you presented a fantastical realm or world where you have a kind of Nietzschean character who wants to be a Superman, and so in other words, if Harry Potter had a Voldemort character and Voldemort was clearly presented as a real kind of hero, he's not. So Harry Potter's a really interesting case in point. So in Harry Potter, you have a very interesting character in Harry Potter because he's conflicted as well, because there's a dark tug in his own life. He's got a very intimate connection with Lord Voldemort in the first place. But there's also, even when if you've read Harry Potter, when they put the sorting hat on, which tells you which school to go to, he was nearly in, I think is it Slytherin? He was nearly in that
I'm in
house.
the camp
The
of people
hat
who have never
was
read
kind of
Harry Potter,
ambivalent on it.
so you're you can say
Well,
whatever you want, and I
what
won't know.
makes it interesting, and as the series continues, he has to face more and more of these very serious decisions of moral. There's more moral conflict, and he's got to choose the right way over the way of basically power. The same is true, by the way, in Star Wars with Luke Skywalker. As Christians, we can laugh off some of the ideas of the Force and all of that, the dark side of the Force, but there's that big pull for Luke Skywalker, and he resists it. So again,
Well, you have
you
Peter and the
have
White
and even
Witch would
even
be
when
the
it
same.
correct. Yeah. So what I'm making a case for is, in a lot of fantasy, do you have a healthy depiction of virtue, or is vice rewarded? I think that's the real way you can test the metal of
So,
fiction, and most
how
fantasy
about
falls into the virtue is rewarded category. Yeah.
you would say Game of Thrones is not helpful fantasy for your spiritual formation?
So I genuinely don't know. Well, I've never watched, I've never read Game of Thrones, and I've certainly never watched it either. And I have strong feelings about about the viewing of Game of Thrones. I know that'll step on
Okay,
some toes,
but that's not
so
for
I
the
can't really speak to that one.
but that's not you're not making that decision based off of whether or not virtue is rewarded, right? You're saying it just goes beyond the pale of
No,
what's wise to
so
put
I
into your
think
mind
yeah.
as a
So I
human.
think this is a general rule of thumb with art. Yeah. So you move from. I mean, if a work of art becomes excessive or gratuitous or self indulgent, that can count as that I think I mean, obviously that makes it harmful in some way. It can make it harmful, and I think not Lord of the Rings, sorry, Game of Thrones, from what I've read about it and the reputation it has, clearly fits into that category.
All right. So let me provide. I really like the distinction you're making here about how is virtue handled within it. So that would be a really not like so. Say you like the Princess and the Goblin, George MacDonald. That is a book about virtue.
Hmm.
Um, so there's that element of it. Here's where I think somebody could be listening to this, and I think growing up, my parents fit in this category as well. Of that, we do sometimes have a tendency to say um, in the material that we read personally, individually, or that we're choosing for our children or other young people in our life, of saying, "Oh, well, it has this good element to it, so it's worth it." There's a sense in there, is always in my mind, is that rat poison is 99% corn. It's the 1% of the ingredients that kills you, and so I
Sure.
think there's a slippery slope here that, while using what I think you've laid out for us, is a very helpful, like, virtue is rewarded. I think it'll be a level of personal discernment for everybody of where they draw that line of saying, um, I'm sure you can find something virtuous in Game of Thrones. I have no idea. I'm just guessing. Like almost if you want, or you see this, I see this more in like kids stuff that's like the category of edutainment. So it's like supposed to be educational, but it's entertainment, and it has like one
Yeah.
neat fact about a tiger in it. Um, there's a sense there where I think you and I can't answer this for everybody on every book series or topic. Um, but I think you and I can both say, hey, there are forms of fantasy written by thoughtful people that help us
Mhm.
think about our faith in the world in really constructive ways. And then the opposite of that is totally true. But the dosing there of the relative
Well,
virtuous content to
mhm.
the gratuitousness is something that it would be really hard for us to draw a line
Well,
on a
you
podcast and say here's what's in and what's out.
well, you made a major jump there from what we were talking about to Game of Thrones. So this is there are clearly works of fantasy that are geared
Yeah.
yeah, that are geared toward adults. So even the Game of Thrones series by George R. Martin, this is for adult. I mean, it's geared for adults. The
Hmm.
Chronicles of Narnia, these are books that are written for children, but adults, of course, can benefit from them massively as well. So yeah, there are those differences as well. But yeah, you have to look at the when you look at something like Game of Thrones, you ask the same questions you would of any piece of entertainment or work of art. When you're evaluating how its
Yeah. So,
content and seeing if it's edifying or not. Or
well,
Mhm.
I was looking for an extreme example there, but the extreme examples usually are never helpful in decision making. So let's set that aside because you could say like, should my 8-year-old watch Game of Thrones? No. Next question. It's and so I think this is where if
Mhm.
you're a parent listening to this, you're not trying to decide whether or not to show Game of Thrones to your kid. You're thinking of, um, yeah, I'm trying to come up with something that's a little more middle of the road there, where you could kind of in your mind justify it in both directions. And so I think that brings us back to how is how it, yeah, how is virtue handled? What is celebrated as the good? And then the diversity on opinions would probably be what are the mechanisms whereby that
Yeah.
manifests itself in the
Well, what
story.
were the well with something like Harry Potter, for instance, that was very controversial and in some ways still remains that way. When I talk to people about it, the main item of concern really seemed to be centered on magic. And
Uh-huh.
so, I mean, that
Well,
there is a sense in which, yeah.
so let me say there's one other line of thinking there that I think does have some merit on some things where
Mhm.
there are there are genres of fantasy that make spiritual realities seem like they're fictional. And so I think that's the better Christian argument against it, is to say, do some of these forms of fantasy fictionalize or trivialize realms of reality that I think are true? So no Christian is going to believe that Hogwarts is a true place, but it it might
Mhm.
set up for some people in the category of saying, well, the spiritual realm, and again, you have to make a distinction between spiritualism and religious practice and magic, which I see as two, well, anyway, that's a whole nother ball of wax. But I think that would be the thing of saying this is clearly um, marketed as fantasy, but it does traffic in some themes that we think are real, like good and evil isn't a category of fantasy. That's a
Mhm.
category of reality. So
Right.
so therein, I think, is the one of the more foundational elements of saying, are we want to celebrate the things that help us understand reality, but we also, I think, specifically with children, want to help them see that sometimes fantasy does trivialize some of the things that we see and believe to be true as spiritual creatures in the real world. Our 4-year-old is forever asking us about a video clip or something like, is that in the real world or is that in our world? And it's interesting to watch a little mind try to decide like what types of
Mhm.
um, if you show them a video of an orca killing a great white shark, which you should, that's fantastic. Watch that this week if you can. Um, that's an amazing thing. But a 4-year-old doesn't know whether or not that's computer generated or that it really are orcas that can kill great white sharks. And so part of the
Mhm.
parenting role
Mhm.
there is to help the kids see, yes, this is part of the real world. No, this isn't part of the real world. And the interaction back and forth there for little people, I think, is a trickier phase of discernment while they're trying to sort out what's real and what's not. So 2 extra cents there.
Yeah, I mean, and I think I'm not sure I see the trivialization of what we take for to be reality as clearly. So think about something like the Pilgrim's Progress, which is, a very straightforward, very unsubtle, but still
Mhm.
extremely powerful allegory. Would you say that that trivializes the spiritual life?
No, I also don't
I
see
think if any,
college-age students
no,
dressing up like Christian and running around college campuses playing Quidditch. So I think the degree
sure,
to
but
which it
mhm.
captivates and embeds itself into an alternative reality that people want the that this would be the
Okay,
other
so
part
this is
is there
helpful,
are people
Nathan.
who then want to
There's
live
a
in that fantasy.
Okay, so here you're bringing up something very important that we need to talk about. The word that I would use here is escapist.
Yeah, okay. Yep,
So
I think so.
there yes, so there is, and in this sense, and that is, you're right, that is a harmful aspect of that can be a harmful aspect of fantasy. So there is fantasy that good fantasy, like George MacDonald, like Lord of the Rings, like Chronicles of Narnia, like Harry Potter, there I said it, is actually going to put you in touch with reality in a deeper sense. It's going to teach you lessons about courage and friendship and perseverance and discernment of right and wrong. But a bad element of fantasy is that it can become escapist. It can become an escape from reality, and people can hide in it. And yes, some people, Harry Potter has lent itself to that as an abuse, and I think that is an abuse. I don't think that's necessarily
It
a
wasn't the
reflection
intent.
of
Yeah.
any deficiency in Harry Potter. Correct,
Mhm.
but that is no, but that is something that happens. I mean, in some ways, and I'm going to step on some toes here. I mean, look at certain people who, I get it. Some people like to go to Disneyland and Disney World. That's fine. I feel sorry for you. Just kidding. But there are
But
those
other people
who
wanna
go
live
there, and
there.
it really is like, yeah, who want to live there. It's like walking into some sort of paradisal realm where you're sheltered from the harsh realities of this world. And I think most of us, if we take a step back, can agree that's not necessarily a healthy
Mhm.
mindset. And there also, by the way, we see some of the deficiencies of the Harlequin romance novels, the Amish romance novels, the Danielle Steele stuff, because usually we will recognize in a straightforward way, oh, reading is good for you. But if you see somebody reading that, you think, oh, well, maybe not that so much. Why? What do we mean by that? Most people just intuitively get that because it's a narrow escape from reality. And so this is not actually making you think. It's not actually making you face life in any serious way. It's you
Mhm.
escaping into an elaborate, because there's we use fantasy when we talk about a genre, but there's a bad version of fantasy that we use when we talk about something like a sexual fantasy, for instance.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that involves narrow escapism, that involves just self-indulgence,
So
and
let's go
that
down a list here, though.
obviously is something that is not good.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
here's one that I struggled with. One of the seminaries that I attended, frequently between classes, I had classmates that were running around campus in their, like, late 20s. This is when Pokemon Go came out, trying to catch Pokemon on their phone
Hmm.
between their theology lectures. And for whatever, like, it's just so comically,
Sure.
I don't like. There's so many ironies involved there, but I couldn't quite figure out, like, is that an escapism from something, or is that general entertainment, or so the whole Pokemon thing is
Hmm.
fascinating to me on that front. But then you had mentioned in a previous podcast, like the Wing Feather Saga, which is as fantastical as they get, but does have a story plot arc of good versus evil and development and moral decision making and formation and forgiveness and um, so I guess everybody's going to draw those lines at different places, but uh, it's a really good question, and it's not
Yeah.
going away anytime soon.
So let me just sum up for our listeners just some practical takeaways here. I think that we've named. So one is,
Please do
is
something useful
virtue
with this.
rewarded or is vice? Yeah. So number one, is virtue rewarded in this fantastical realm, or is vice rewarded? And let me give you a subset of that where I think some Christians are concerned. I'm concerned here too. Another way of the vice being rewarded thing would come in a lot of our newer fantasy that reimagines monsters as not monsters, but simply misunderstood.
Ah. Hmm.
So even about the Wizard of Oz. Are you a good witch or a bad witch? Well, good witch and bad witch is a little bit of that's a confusing way to put it for young people, don't you think?
Hmm.
So, do you have is this a fantasy where good and evil the lines really are firmly drawn? There is such a thing as evil. There is such a thing as good. Now, I understand moral complexity. I get that, and I like complex characters. Again, as a modern example, I think Harry Potter is a good example. You see him struggle, you see him make mistakes, you see him fall, but in the end, he chooses the good. And it's very clear that Voldemort is evil and the good people are good. But so in that is vice rewarded? Do you have a story like Wicked? And we're just about to get a new version of Wicked in theaters, where the formerly Wicked Witch is given a much more sympathetic treatment, or Disney's Maleficent. So it's very
Hmm.
interesting to watch, Sleeping Beauty, where Maleficent is so clearly malign and bad, and then Maleficent, where she's Angelina Jolie portrays her, and she's a way more complex character. We have a habit nowadays of trying to make every monster misunderstood and not really a monster. And I think
Yeah.
that's a recipe for some serious moral confusion.
There's
So we
also,
need to bear that in mind.
all right, while we're making things awkward though, we can take it like let's walk this over into the Marvel universe a little bit, where you have people
Hmm.
who are basically jerks but are good at what they do. Like if you can save the world, then you can do whatever else you want to, kind of, or treat people. I mean, so it's not
Hmm.
just in fantasy, that's across all of our entertainment of
Yeah.
what is the ideal of the hero in this story, and what type of person are they, and is that something worth emulating in our own lives? That's not just for little
Hmm.
kids to ask
So that
on their intake.
all of that's under that vice virtue category, which is really important because our world right now, our culture, let me just tell you, traditional heroism, we sneer at it and we're very cynical and jaded on it. Christians sometimes fall into that trap as well. And that's why Peter Kraft will say when he reads Lord of the Rings with his students at Boston College, some of them will come across some of those descriptions of the characters and just they'll roll their eyes. And he says they're not used to these kind of archetypal descriptions of goodness,
Hmm. Hmm.
because we're so used to the Walter Whites, the characters with who are the good bad guys, if you will, the deeply flawed character. I mean, in America, we've been obsessed with criminals and people like that for a long time. The Tony Sopranos, but genuine goodness. And again, to point to Gilead once again, part of what makes Gilead special, it's not a fantasy novel, but is that it gives you a compelling portrayal of goodness, which is very difficult to do. It takes exquisite skill to make goodness real and interesting. Usually it
Yeah.
comes across as, sentimental and goody two shoes and annoying, but when it's done well, it's very inspired and inspiring. But so there's that vice virtue element, and then there's the escapist element.
Hmm.
Fantasy is
Hmm.
good when it's an invitation to think deeply about life, friendship. I mean, really, just when it enlivens your understanding, enriches your understanding of life. It's bad when it serves as a narrow form of escapism. And note, good fantasy can do that. So you might be abusing good fantasy. So people do this with Lord of the Rings, by the way. So it's important to recognize that it's yeah, the escapist element is a very serious one. It's a real one.
How about this as we bring this to a close? That there's a sense, I think, in which fantasy is helpful to the degree that it helps you understand reality and the truth and the, let's say, the true story, the real world that you live in. And so I think this might help with the parenting thing too, is like, does your child have a vision of reality that has a cohesive story, or in the old language, worldview to it? Do you have something to compare and contrast when you're watching
Mm,
fantasy? Because for some people, the fantasy then does become the most interesting part of the world. And that is a travesty if the fantastical world becomes more fascinating than the world that you live in, which is full of twinkling stars and earthworms and bumblebees and all sorts of other
mhm.
fascinating things. So I think, do we have the ability to compare and contrast as we're reading, Cameron, you often say discernment is saying this, not this. That only works if you have two options before you. So I think as far as our own personal spiritual formation and in the teaching of our children is giving them a clear sense of an alternative to the other stories of the world, a clear sense of this is how I see the world to be true. And we're comparing everything to that. So the degree to which you can do that probably also therefore sets up the degree to which you can handle and process and think through some fantasy constructively as well. So it's kind of like, the whole thing to learn how to spot a counterfeit. You study the real thing. You don't study the counterfeits. And so I think helping people decide what is true means having intentional times of teaching in your home and in your own life daily, of reminding yourself of the things that are true, the way that the world really works, who God is, who you are, the relationship between the two, and then what your responsibilities are as someone made in his image, under the style of Christ and by the power of the Holy Spirit. That's where we focus our energy. And then the rest of these things are in the eddies in the periphery of the conversation of reality, and sometimes helpfully reflect illuminating light back into what Christ wants for us. But at other times can be a distraction. So I think that's the line that we'll walk individually, as families, as communities, as churches. This isn't going away. we are now way over our heads in the digital age. So blessings to you all as you try to sort that out in your own lives and your families. And I'm thankful to Cameron, who can give some vocabulary and some meaningful ways in which we can wrestle with these questions. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where this isn't really about the current event. This is where we're just talking about livable Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.